All right, why don't we get going? Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Perry World House. My name is Mike Horowitz. I'm the faculty director here. For those of you, if it's your first event with us, World House is the University of Pennsylvania's hub for global engagement, where we bridge the gap between academia and the policy world on the world's most pressing issues. Our work is structured around four pillars: democracy, security, climate change, and global justice and human rights. About a month ago, we held a rapid response event on Venezuela. And I recall our panelists, Sam Vinograd and Bill Burke-White, saying it would be extremely difficult to predict what would happen over the next few months in Venezuela. Indeed, they were correct. Now we have strikes against the regime, the subsequent capture of Venezuela President Nicolas Maduro, and his extradition to the United States. And although things have changed a lot since the last time we spoke, there now remain all of these questions about U.S. actions and how it will affect the hemisphere, about what this means for the people of Venezuela, both citizens abroad and those at home, and what it means for global politics. And to answer these questions and more, I'm excited to introduce our three panelists. Our first speaker today is Sam Vinograd, joining us once again. She is a distinguished visiting fellow at Perry World House this year and leads Brunswick's U.S. political practice. She served under three administrations in high-level positions at the U.S. Departments of Homeland Security and Treasury, as well as the National Security Council staff. Most important, she received her BA in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Carolina Jimenez Sandoval is the president of the Washington Office on Latin America and also a World House Distinguished Visiting Fellow this year. She has over 20 years of experience in research and advocacy for human rights in the Americas and worldwide, and as a leader in the field with extensive experience in the region and Washington, she guides their team to achieve strategic impact in justice and human rights. And last but not least, Bob Scher is the former head of international affairs for BP America and a non-resident senior advisor at Perry World House. At BP, he tracked and analyzed U.S. foreign policy as it affected BP's businesses around the world. He has close to 25 years of experience in senior government affairs and national security roles in the United States government, including when he unfortunately had to work with me in the then Department of Defense, but always the Pentagon. To start, what I would like to do is ask each of our panelists to give us maybe 2 to 4 minutes on what is actually happening in Venezuela. Let me start with Sam because she was part of our last conversation about this issue. Sam, what has changed since we last spoke?
Well, since we last spoke, Nicolas Maduro is no longer in Venezuela. Many are still calling him the president of Venezuela, but he's no longer in Venezuela. And you're right. We said last time we couldn't predict exactly what was going to happen, but gosh, was that an incredible operation that got Nicolas Maduro. We'll talk about the why and what it means, but the skill and the myriad resources involved in shutting down electricity in Caracas, seating a CIA operative long enough to understand pattern of life for Maduro and his wife, just truly mind-boggling. So what's happened is Maduro is no longer in power because of this incredible operation. When you look at the situation in Venezuela, and then I'm going to put this in a broader context, Maduro loyalists are still in charge. Individuals that are under sanction by the United States or have indictments against them by the United States are still in power. So, from a kind of quote unquote counter narcotics perspective, which is what the Trump administration said a lot of this mission was about, you still have a lot of folks associated with that threat stream still active in Venezuela. The focus on Venezuela from the administration has predominantly now shifted to economic opportunity, both for the United States and for, importantly, the people of Venezuela. And I'm going to bifurcate that in two ways. The first is oil that's already out of the ground, and I'm sure Bob will talk about this. And the second is oil that could be out of the ground at some undetermined time. The administration is very focused in the immediate term on negotiating with the sitting regime on getting Venezuelan oil that's already out to the United States to sell at a market price, and then for those funds to be deposited ostensibly in U.S. bank accounts to then be transferred back to the people of Venezuela at some time. For those of us that served in Iraq, this is bringing us back to things like Oil for Food, Development Fund for Iraq, and more. break. There's also a big focus on convincing oil executives that investing in oil exploration and development in Venezuela over the longer term is in their immediate best interest. The president's meeting with oil executives on Friday did not rally the excitement that he had hoped. I'll let Bob comment on that more. But in terms of the kind of immediate investment potential in Venezuela, that is more than complicated. To quote the CEO of ExxonMobil, it is currently uninvestable. That is even if Secretary Bessent follows through on his pledges to eliminate sanctions against the Venezuelan oil sector. The actual commercial interest in Venezuela, it'll take a long time to get the conditions right for large corporates to go in there for longer term projects. Meanwhile, the United States administration is doing all the right things in terms of exploring reopening a diplomatic presence in Caracas, which security wise would still be quite difficult based on the volatility of the environment in Venezuela. And just using all the tools in their toolkit to, I think, convince Delcy Rodriguez that doing what the US administration wants is in her best interest as well as her colleagues' best interest. I think that if she can make a deal with the Trump administration on this oil that's already been pumped, that will help smooth things over, at least for a shorter period of time. The last thing I'm going to do, and then I'll stop talking, is let's put this in the broader context. Why Venezuela? We could talk about why Greenland. Today, we're talking about why Venezuela. Why Venezuela? In the Trump national security strategy, there is a very heavy focus on the Western Hemisphere and what they call a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The goals are ostensibly to enable U.S. engineered and directed growth in the Western Hemisphere that minimizes irregular migration flows, that minimizes counter narcotics, and that sets up regional champions that work with the United States in a productive way. Behind the scenes on all of that, there is also a lot of talk about, and I'm curious what Carolina has to say about this, what ultimately the United States wants from partners in the Western Hemisphere. Is it really stability and security, or is it access to oil? Is it access to critical minerals? My personal view it's probably all the above, not to mention pushing out foreign influence. And that augurs the question finally of, is Venezuela one and done, or will there be more action in Venezuela? Is Cuba next? And what does this mean for the United States pushing power globally? I do think Cuba is next. If the president went into Venezuela, Cuba is an easier operation in certain respects. But going into Cuba is going to set off a whole other firestorm of feedback and impacts from Mexico, from Brazil, from others. And so I do think we should expect similar action in Cuba while we wait to see if Delcy Rodriguez is able to kind of stabilize things with the Trump administration for at least the near term. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks so much. Let me go to Bob next.
Great. Thanks, folks. Yeah, no, I started to write this a few days ago and then realized that was a wrong idea. I'd have to wait till much sooner. Look, I want to try to separate my thoughts into sort of three categories, but I'll condense it to two, Mike, I promise. Sort of what is it that we know? What is it that we don't know? And what do we need to watch? As Sam said, look, we know that the U.S. military, in coordination with the intelligence community, executed an incredibly successful operation to capture Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, and bring them back to the United States to face criminal charges. And again, we can go more into the operation. I could lean more on my defense side. We could talk more about the operational piece. But suffice it to say, Maduro and his Cuban bodyguards were expecting something like this or worried about something like this. So even in that context, incredible preparation, incredible execution, always a little bit of luck helps too. We also have to recognize there's still a formidable U.S. military force offshore Venezuela, and without doubt, other plans that, operations that could be conducted if called upon, and they are likely to be able to be executed quickly if need be. We also know that pretty much all of the elements of power and violence and governance, both formal and informal, within the Maduro regime remain in place. Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, is nominally in charge of the nation, but I don't think we can yet look at this and say it's regime change, since the regime stays fairly much in place, at least at this point. We also know that the person who won the elections in Venezuela last year, Edmundo Gonzalez, and the leader of the opposition, Maria Corina Machado, are not in the country and frankly don't seem to be supported by the Trump administration to lead the country, Venezuela at this time. We see that the Trump administration thinks it can control the actions of the government of Venezuela, both through pressure tactics of controlling the oil exports and the money with that, and the threat of additional military action that it can take, kind of hanging over everybody. When it comes to the energy side, look, we know Venezuela has been producing somewhere between 600 and 800,000 barrels of oil a day for export. That puts them around the 20th largest producer. Not really that much. Look, as recently as 2024, that was about 1 million barrels of oil. At its peak, Venezuela exported over 3 million. We're not, that's the kind of boundary conditions that we're looking at. But it's not nothing, but it's also not a huge amount right now compared to a lot of other countries, including the US. We know also that the majority of the infrastructure for producing oil in Venezuela is old and or broken. Chevron still has maintained some pieces there. That is still in pretty good shape. But we also know that most, if not all, of the domestic expertise within Venezuela in PDVSA to get to work on that industry has fled the nation. And it's going to take years and significant capital investment to get production up much beyond sort of the 1 to 1.3 million barrels of oil a day rate that I think we saw, if you can imagine sanctions being taken off, which, as Sam points out, have not been yet. We also know that the legal regimes in both Venezuela and the United States are very much in place as they were before. It makes it very hard, and I can talk much more about this if you wish, to have companies, banks, traders to know what they are stepping into and begin to contemplate re-entry into the energy sector in Venezuela and figure out what the Trump administration actually wants the industry to do. What we don't know, and I think, as I said, given the constraints on time, is a little bit intellectually lazy, but I'll combine this with what we need to watch for. I have a couple of things. One, what happens to the other issues that the Trump administration talked about in terms of Venezuela, particularly migrants, drugs, and democracy? Are these still issues they care about? Were they ever really issues that were a big deal? And since now we have a victory, if it wasn't that bad, we now have a victory. No fentanyl is coming into the United States from Venezuela anymore. It never was. Is the removal of Maduro and the maintenance of the regime, does that mean that these issues are solved? How much is the Venezuelan current leadership, do they want to address these problems or even be able to address these problems given how systemic some of these are? I'd also note, Sam kind of hinted at this, as there are I believe various actors within the administration all supported this action. I fully doubt that all of them that supported it did it for the same reasons. That doesn't matter at first, but it's going to matter a lot as you go forward to see what are the pieces that Marco Rubio versus Stephen Miller care about the most. I think it is entirely unknown how the Trump administration is actually going to implement their policies towards the energy sector. Is the sanctions regime going to be relaxed across the board or specific licenses? Where exactly will the oil go? Who will want to touch it without sanctions being relaxed and taken off? What companies are going to be willing to look at it? What private companies are willing to take a risk to go into Venezuela? And how is the US actually going to assist them with mitigating commercial and security risk? Look, Sam mentioned the CEO of ExxonMobil had the temerity to say in public that Venezuela was uninvestable. And then Trump said, well, maybe Exxon won't be invited. Again, I can see Darren Woods, the CEO, going, oh no, don't invite me. That's terrible. I hate it. We'll talk more about this, I'm sure, in Q&A. But look, how much capital are companies going to want to spend in Venezuela, given the security situation, the legal situation in Venezuela and the US? The estimate, Rystad, I think, did an estimate of over $100 billion needed over 10 to 15 years to get to any level closer to sort of the 2 million mark versus the 1.2, 1.4 million. And I think, look, the majors right now are unlikely to go in because they have a limited amount of capital expenditure that they have, and there are better places to put it in right now, unless something dramatically changes and or there's support from the US. Are there going to be smaller companies, privately owned ones? Great, they could do it too, but where, with what money? With their own? Are banks going to be involved, and how does that work? There's another question about how much new oil is going to be on the market, how soon, who will buy it. China buys most of it now. Are they going to get some still? Is that okay, or is that a problem? India, are they going to use that to replace Russian crude? Certainly some of it will go to the US, but in the end, it's not a huge amount to go into the market, and I suspect that prices won't go down much as a result. And if they do, then you have even a bigger hurdle for companies to want to make major investments. I'll try to finish this up quickly, but Delcy Rodriguez, how's she going to manage? If there's one person I would not want to be right now, it is her. Um, how is she going to manage the competing interests, the governing structures in Venezuela? Is she going to change it? Or is she going to, how does she stay on the right side of President Trump and also her own regime? Um, does the current administration and the people who make up the regime think their days are numbered? Is now the time to get as much as you can and get out? Or are they going to continue on like the old days? I think the opposition figure, Machado, how does she deal with this? That's a tough one. And I think, as Sam kind of hinted at instead, in many cases, what happens in Cuba? What is an emboldened Trump likely to do versus threatening to do? What kind of messages does this send to other nations, both the strong ones who believe they can do what they should or whatever they want, and the weaker ones who suffer what they must? And, sort of, what does that do in terms of other actions around the globe? I will stop there. I'm happy to offer my thoughts on any of the questions I've asked, but we'll move on from there.
Carolina.
Thank you, Michael, and very good to be here with such esteemed colleagues. I'd like to, offer some perspective from within Venezuela, having been talking to partners on the ground, for the last 10 days, nonstop. So allow me to speak, about what Venezuela has gone through for the last few years and how this context ties with what we witnessed in the early hours of January 3rd, just really just a few days ago. I think everybody knows that Venezuela is a country affected by a severe humanitarian emergency. 1 in every 3 Venezuelans is food insecure. The health system collapsed years ago, and 8 million people, a little over 25% of the population, fled the country in just over a decade. All of this happened under a very repressive and authoritarian regime. Venezuela remains the only country in the Americas with an open investigation before the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. To this day, over 1,000 people are in prison due to political reasons and grave human rights violations such as enforced disappearances, arbitrary detentions, torture, sexual and gender violence, and extrajudicial killings have been documented for years. But Venezuelans believe in democracy. And no other event, I think, proved this point more than the elections that took place in July 2024, when Venezuelans overwhelmingly voted for Edmundo González Urrutia to become president. But the will of Venezuelans was blatantly ignored by Nicolas Maduro, who chose to stay in power. And when Venezuelans came to the streets to protest for his unlawful declaration of victory, Maduro launched a strategy of repression that killed over 25 people and put thousands in jail. Unfortunately, that repression continued until this day. And it is hard, to be a Venezuelan, to be a journalist, to be a union leader, to be a human rights defender. Informing, working as a human rights defender can put you in jail. But despite this deplorable human rights record, the truth is that no matter how repressive Nicolas Maduro's regime and the continuation of the regime is, This record does not justify a U.S. military intervention that clearly breaches international law. The United States has violated key principles of the United Nations Charter, especially Article 2.4, which very clearly states that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. Needless to say, there has been a major international outcry due to these actions, unilateral actions taken by the US. Multiple governments worldwide have raised alarms, and for many countries in the region, this is a message coming from the United States that the US is back to a sort of gamble diplomacy. And it sends a very terrible precedent that the US is willing to use, military resources to conduct hemispheric affairs. We strongly believe that the US Congress should assert its oversight power over the executive branch and investigate not only the event of January 3rd, but also the 32 unlawful boat strikes that killed at least 115 people since September 2025. And beyond supporting, the World Powers Resolution on Venezuela, it should also speak forcefully about the Venezuela's grave human rights violation. But to conclude, we really think it is important that now, as we speak, the US administration uses its leverage to support a negotiation process centered on the rights of Venezuelans. Because Delcy Rodriguez and her brother and the repressive apparatus is still in place. If we don't center this process on the right of Venezuelans to support a real democratic transition, our main concerns, the ones we had before January the 3rd, remain. Our major concern is to be living a transition without transition, a transition without democracy, a mere change of an unfriendly authoritarian for a US-friendly authoritarian. And needless to say, I believe Venezuelans deserve democracy and respect for their human rights, something they have been fighting for relentlessly for many years. So I leave it here and welcome the discussion. Thank you.
No, thanks so much. I mean, those are great. Those are great opening statements. And I see some of you watching already dropping questions into the Q&A section of the Zoom interface. Thank you so much for that. And let me start with a question that broadens out in some ways from Venezuela to the region. We have lots of given the rate of questions coming in, I will ask our panelists to be somewhat brief in their answers, because I think there's a lot of interest here. But broadening out for the region, how are U.S. actions being viewed throughout the region? There's discussion now about there's this Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine question, the Donroe Doctrine. You've seen in media over the last several days, and in some ways, like pointing at countries like Colombia or Mexico and saying, like, are they next? What's going on here then in the context of what seems like a very heavy pivot by the Trump administration to the Western Hemisphere writ large? Why don't we start with you, Sam, and go around the horn?
Yeah, so I think, and I'm advising a lot of clients on this right now because I think there's definitely the potential for impact in the hemisphere, particularly as it pertains to Mexico and Canada when it comes to US-based businesses operating in those jurisdictions and the renegotiation of the USMCA. So I think the impacts of this action will have more medium to longer term impacts from a trade perspective and perhaps for US-based businesses operating in the hemisphere, as well as globally. We can talk about that if you want. The reactions from the hemisphere have been relatively differentiated. Brazil was strong. Unsurprisingly, Mexico was strong, but then when he talked about using military action against cartels, Scheinbaum kind of wisely was like, that's just Trump being Trump. I do think that this will be elevated when Trump does something in Cuba. I think that will also materially shift the rhetoric. So we should expect more strong words from partners in the Western Hemisphere and countries in the Western Hemisphere. We should expect potential commercial impact on businesses from a trade perspective. And for folks operating in the hemisphere, just like being mindful of, you know, US employees, colleagues, and otherwise just traveling in the hemisphere. Emotions are high. And I think it's just, worth just thinking about all of that as you, plan your travel and think about your companies.
Sorry, Carolina or Bob, you want to jump in on this?
I, I think essentially there's a lot still to play out, right? I mean, and some of it depends upon where you think Donald Trump is versus his advisors in terms of what's next. Clearly, again, countries are learning quickly how to deal with Donald Trump. You try not to tell him no in public. He does not respond well to being told he can't do something. Witness Greenland and Denmark. Um, but I think people are starting to realize, okay, this is about deals and commercial transactions for Trump, and that regardless of what his advisors want and for what reasons they're doing things. And I think Marco Rubio, if you believe Marco Rubio is setting the agenda, then obviously Cuba is next in some way, manner, or fashion. If you believe it's commercial, then, maybe you wait around and you let Cuba, you see what happens with Cuba not having the resources that Venezuela was providing it. And, but you are looking for deals, you're looking for commercial activity, and you're opening up to try to give it so that Donald Trump can be a deal maker within the hemisphere. And clearly you're being very wary about how much you are seen to be working with China and others from outside of the region.
I will say just one thing very briefly. I want to know if there was anyone in this call expecting the magnitude of the attacks of January the 3rd. Until that morning, we all expected some form of attack because when you look at the build up in the Caribbean, having the Gerald Ford there and looking at the attacks on the so-called narco vessels, our analysis was pointing at some form of attack on Venezuela. We were thinking that maybe there will be attacks on very specific targets, perhaps cocaine labs inside the country, isolated military forts in rural Venezuela. But waking up in the early mornings of January the 3rd to see a South American capital being bombed by the United States, it really wasn't part of my analysis or my expectation. So we do need to understand that for the region, that brings back the memories of the worst times in US Latin America relations. And we haven't seen anything like this since 1989 in Panama or 1994 in Haiti, but nothing like this in the 21st century. So until now, until January the 3rd, many people in the region, especially political leaders in the region, felt that Trump's threats were boisterous threats and empty words. But I think January the 3rd changes that view. I think many leaders now feel that, he is really much more serious about, truly using military means to move forward with his threats than what people were expecting. I mean, there were, I think, 11 or 12 military targets attacked in Venezuela in 4 different states, including the capital. And that, I think, is a game changer for hemispheric affairs in the 21st century.
No, that's a great insight, and it had I don't know of anyone that directly called this sort of immediately before. Like, for example, it looked to me like the forces that the U.S. had in the region were not it was not the appropriate package of forces for a ground invasion. It was the appropriate package of forces for strikes of one sort or another. But no, I think it was very surprising when we all woke up that morning. And I want to follow up with you, Carolina, to turn back to the people of Venezuela and the prospects for democracy in Venezuela. Since on the one hand, We have the Trump administration saying that they wish to, in some ways, work with the existing regime, just a different leader of the existing regime, and promising a future transition in some ways to a democratic future. On the other hand, we have results of a recent election where, in some ways, some estimates were 60 to 70% of the population supporting an alternative to the regime, which would suggest maybe that there might be broad support for a transition faster. What's your sense of how people in Venezuela feel about that, and what opportunities might be to persuade the Trump administration to move faster on that front?
I recently read an interview with, I think it was Christopher Hernandez, who said that the Trump administration has changed the strategy of regime change for regime management. And I thought it was an interesting concept, right? I mean, it seems that the US had learned lessons, that it probably took from Iran, Afghanistan, etc. And it is true that, it in this case, it chose to stay with different figures from the regime that it considered able to avoid major chaos, uh, uh, and still get the head of the regime out, and Nicolas Maduro and Cilia Flores. The truth is that there will be no transition, as I have said in different occasions now, without the dismantling of the repressive apparatus and political opening. And those two things, at the moment, the repressive structure is intact, and there is no political opening. So my main concern is that Secretary Rubio's plan, he divided it in three phases: stabilization, recovery, and transition. Well, there is no timeline attached. And so far, it's hard to understand if Venezuelan voices and actors are included in the plan, when and how. So it's a very general and broad plan that doesn't seem to be including, Venezuelan key actors in the design of this plan. I'm not sure it's a plan, but that's how he presented it. I think one important thing to see is that, to be honest, we could see concrete steps. And that's my biggest fear. We are not seeing the concrete steps. Take the release of political prisoners, for example. So far, till this morning, only 70 political prisoners have been released. There are over 1,000. So when you think about the victims, I mean, we have hundreds of families in front of prisons waiting for their loved ones. It's very hard for them to be patient. They've been waiting for years, for months, etc. So we do know that political will get them out. So why are they not released faster, more expeditious? We don't know. Why aren't some key members of the repressive structure being, put at least, on leave? We don't know. Why are some people in the military being asked to be on leave? We don't know. So the apparatus of repression is intact. Political openings, I think sooner than later, we will need to see changes in cabinet, or at least changes in many political parties that are outlawed, etc. So far, no discussion on political openings. A potential new calendar for elections and change in the electoral authority, we don't know. So there are so many questions regarding key factors that should be in place for a transition, that this is still very, very opening. And, of course, as a human rights defender, we're very keen to understand what will happen with transitional justice and not talk about it. So our main concern is that the truth is that, it was very unclear what was the plan of the day after, and it doesn't seem that the administration had a clear plan for this.
Bob, Sam, you want to jump in on this? All right, well, let's move on, and why don't we start with you on the next one, Bob? And there's, I think I've been scanning through the questions that we're getting through the Q&A box here in the Zoom interface. Please keep them coming, and most of them mention oil. in one way, in one way or another. And there are a couple of different questions here. And keeping in mind that I realize each of these, all of you actually could probably talk about indefinitely from like one angle or another. What does it mean when Trump says that the U.S. is getting Venezuela's oil? Who is the U.S. thus like getting it from? What are the prospects in some ways for substantial access to Venezuela's oil in the short term? And maybe most importantly for some people, what will this mean for how much you pay if you fill up your car with oil, with gas?
30 seconds or less, sure. So, I mean, I think one of the
Easy.
first things to kind of clarify is, one of the things President Trump has been saying is that they stole U.S. oil. Okay, let's just set the baseline. Oil, natural resources of a country belong to that country. What he's probably referring to is the nationalization of oil companies and projects, which in fact happened sort of twice in Venezuela. Once in the way that that was all good, people were compensated, et cetera, in the 1970s. One was during Chavez, and it was not done quite as according to international law and commercial law. And there's still suits about that Exxon and ConocoPhillips. Look, so I think it's still really unclear what this all means, right? There's a certain amount of oil that was in storage. How much of that is the stuff that's moving 50 million barrels people have talked about. I saw an article just today about, traders, some of the trading companies taking it and marketing it to India. Most of this oil went to China either at a reduced rate or to repay debts from Venezuela. I think it's unclear what it is. But I think what's important to remember about Venezuelan oil is twofold. One, the infrastructure, the reservoirs, this has been almost systematically destroyed as a result of not having U.S. majors in or independent companies and losing all of the expertise that used to exist in Venezuela, very much so. You can't just sort of restart this, right? In fact, and no one who is telling you, if they're telling you how many barrels can get back on over at about 1.3 million a day, because that's essentially what people think Chevron could do with what it's got, because it knows its facilities, it can invest more and it can export more, and not just export to the United States. But beyond that, nobody really knows what the state of the reservoirs are. If you don't maintain reservoirs, it's not a tap, it's not an on off switch. You have to put a significant amount of money, a significant amount of technology into it. It's a specific type of crude. It's very sour, it's very heavy. You actually need to import oil and diluents to Venezuela in order to get that heavy crude out of Venezuela and into a shape where it can be processed. There are a lot of refineries that can process this, but a refinery is not a switch either, where you go, oh, okay, now I'm going to use and refine this kind of crude oil. So there are many things that need to be done, and I think we just don't know the answer to that. In terms of the market writ large, pardon the pun, it's a very liquid market. So if more is coming on, and again, we're talking about 500, at best 500,000 barrels a day coming on in a market that is about 100 million barrels a day produced, 12 to 13 by the US alone. That's not going to quite make the same impact that people think it's going to make. So if China's not getting it, great, it'll get it from somewhere else. Canada, other places, right? Who knows? So I think it's not going to actually push the amount, the price of crude down significantly. And by the way, if it does, that has the adverse effect of making it less likely that companies are going to want to invest major amounts of capital into getting crude out of the ground in Venezuela, which is expensive to get out because of a lot of different geological characteristics. Hence, if you're not going to make that money back, you're not going to invest it. So as the price goes down, the appetite for anybody to invest goes down as well. So it is more complex than I think that certainly many people in the administration think it is. It will not be easy under the best of circumstances, even if everything is changed in terms of legal and security. And I think, look, some smaller companies, wildcatters, whatever you want to call them, are going to make a lot of money in Venezuela pretty quickly. But I don't think you're going to see major changes in how much Venezuela is producing and hence impact across the world until 5, 10, 15 years. But for Donald Trump, he just wants to control what he can control. He wants to be able to say, I've gotten this amount of crude and look at how much is coming to the US. And I think the impact is not going to be exactly what he wants, but he is going to be able to, by controlling that, if he can effectively do that, I think there's still a lot of legal questions. Then that is the major income from Venezuela, and that is as much as the military pressure. That's a lot of pressure on having Venezuela do whatever else he wants it to do.
Sam, you're muted, Tim.
If we actually think about the oil sector generally, it's interesting. The 2 days when markets opened after the operation that apprehended Maduro, stock prices for companies like Halliburton surged. So as we think about just the general kind of context within Venezuela, yes, it's the energy companies, yes, it's mining companies, but all the logistics companies, security companies, et cetera, are also watching the situation very closely. I think Bob is the expert on all things oil and energy, but just, you know, generally speaking, companies are going to make business-oriented decisions. At the same time, um, many US companies don't want to be viewed as arms of the US government. And I think that's an important point to consider. A lot of the big companies that the administration might want to entice into Venezuela also operate in Brazil, also operate in Colombia. They operate around the world. And so corporates work very hard to ensure that they're not viewed as just, an arm of the US government. I think that a lot of companies are trying to balance for that as they seek to protect their business around the world.
And can I just
Carolina,
jump in?
any?
Like Halliburton, Weatherford, Baker Hughes, Schlumberger, those, I mean, I think we all think about Halliburton as security. They've kind of gotten a little bit more away from that. It's much more oil field services, right? People are going to need to drill. Those are the companies that have the technology to drill. So it is, I think Sam's right to observe that those are the companies that saw a big kind of increase and not some of the other sort of energy sector. You need the technology to drill. Everyone's betting that at least one of those major oil field services companies is going to benefit from this.
And can I just make one other point? Because I think it's interesting as we think about Venezuela. It's also interesting as we think about Iran. But oil markets are at a very different place today than they were five years ago from a supply perspective. And so a lot of people are probably trying to ask Bob to predict what the price of oil is going to be in a year or two. Great mug, Bob. But we're talking about, and this actually pertains to oil companies too, trying to incentivize oil companies to go into a very risky business and security environment to perhaps bring more oil out of the ground in a very geologically complex environment while the market is relatively oversupplied to begin with. That's a different proposition than where energy markets were 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So I think that's also in play and also interesting to think about in the context of Iran and sanctions and their energy markets as well.
Oh, I feel a future event on Iran coming for us. Well, let me get Carolina in here if you want to jump in on this one.
You know, 90% of Venezuelan exports depend on oil. So it's our relationship to oil is much more than economic. It's survival. The survival of the economy depends on the oil markets, and Venezuelans have a cultural, social, political, economic relationship to oil. So when it comes to politics, for example, right now the discussion goes into, well, who is making decisions about oil? And I think there is tremendous tension about, Trump's claims that the oil industry is going to be managed by the US, that the oil belongs to the US because it was stolen, etc. So that is creating a lot of tensions within Venezuela and within the current de facto leadership. That's one thing. The second thing is precisely about investment and about the future of oil production. If indeed sanctions are lifted, as apparently they are going to be, production is increased, and more revenues come into the country, then the big question is who are going to be benefited. Oil companies will certainly increase their benefit, but will that benefit the Venezuelan people? 2025 ended with approximately 650 and 700% inflation. That's probably the highest inflation rate in the world. In a country, as I said, with a humanitarian emergency, where 1 out of 3 people are food insecure. So yeah, we can discuss, the oil markets and how important would be whether or not sanctions are lifted and how much investment there is. But the truth is that people are not seeing any benefits from oil, and many Venezuelans are concerned and about what the US policy towards energy will be. Because if it is just going to be a replacement, of the current policy of the Venezuelan government, where oil is extracted, but it doesn't benefit the people, I think there will be, a lot of anger probably towards just a policy of extraction that doesn't imply distribution of wealth towards the people. But I think with the level of inflation that we're seeing right now, people are incredibly affected by the current economic situation.
So let me stay with you, Carolina, for a follow-up that I know Bob and Sam will want to get in as well, which is, in some ways for Venezuela, Venezuela has been much geopolitically closer to, say, Russia and China over the last decade than the United States. And I see there are a bunch of questions in the Q&A asking about the China angle in particular. And of course, there were those reports that there were Chinese diplomats in the capital just a few hours basically before the strikes who were unaware. What's your sense of how the new leadership in Venezuela will think about their relationship with Russia or China? And is that a thing that the average Venezuelan sort of cares about its tracking, or is it more just a question of those oil revenues translating into food?
It is said that Delcy Rodriguez was in Moscow right before the strikes. So I do think that at the political level, negotiations with Russia and China have been ongoing. But again, I do think that's a very high political level. In my opinion and in my experience talking to people on the ground, to be very honest, the economic situation and the emergency at the humanitarian level is keeping Venezuelans in a very complex survival mode, because the deterioration of the economy in 2025 was very real. But people are on a survival mode with high expectations, which they didn't have before January 3rd. So on the one hand, people are on survival mode because it is becoming very difficult to put food on the table. But at the same time, January 3rd marked a major change in people's life. I mean, Maduro, the strong man who basically occupied everybody's mind day and night, is no longer in the country. So there is a major political change, but the economic situation remains the same. So people have the expectation that the economy will improve, that the US will bring prosperity, but there is a lot of fear, there is confusion. So when I talk to people on the ground, there is expectation, but there is also fear, and there is a lot of uncertainty. So if people don't see political opening, end of repression, but also economic prosperity, I think, there will be major collective disappointment that this didn't bring the change most people desire.
Sam, Bob, you want to hop in here on the China angle?
I'll just say that in speaking to folks in China in particular, just companies there, one big question I have is, do we see any kind of exodus of Chinese companies operating in Venezuela? Not to mention the fact, I mean, China holds a ton of Venezuela is highly indebted to China, so there's just that reality as well. I think that Chinese companies generally are taking a wait and see approach. I think the same is probably true of the Chinese government. It is just too soon to tell how much muscle the Trump administration is going to put behind pushing out foreign influence. It is worth noting that Trump and Xi could have as many as four kind of high-level meetings slash summits this year. I think both presidents are very focused on having those go well, at least the first two. And so you could see some sort of transactional approach to letting China maintain its debt relationship with Venezuela or certain other access um, while the United States tries to publicly show that it is increasing its leverage and influence on the Delcy Rodriguez regime or whomever the successor is. So I think it's going to be a bit bifurcated in that way.
Let me get Bob in briefly and then go back to Carolina.
Yeah. Uh, Look, I think right. The Trump administration Trump feels like, okay, we did our China thing. Let's not raise that again. We don't need to, we're not trying to upset the apple cart on China. I got my deal. We've done what we need to. But clearly, outside influence in Venezuela, in the region, is from China and Russia. He'll raise both of these. I think that's a big piece for a lot of the people in the Trump administration. So you can imagine, I mean, it's almost a mercantilistic kind of a view of we want the resources, we want to be able to control this region. It's our neighborhood. As Sam said, it's in the NSS. But it is, so I don't think it's all about China, but I do think it's a little bit about outside influences, and China happens to be one of the largest ones. I also go back to one of the things I said, which is it depends on who you probably talk to in the administration. We know that Marco Rubio has been a supporter of democracy around the world, but especially in Latin America. Does he care as much about Chinese influence as Stephen Miller, who's focused generally on, it seems now, just great power and also on immigration, right? What are the different factors and sort of trying to determine that there's only one. It's never only one. It's always a mix of these things. But certainly, I don't think it's from a commercial aspect on China because China will get oil from somewhere else, right? They'll be fine. But I do think it's that general feeling of Donald Trump as he views the world. It's about resources. The more oil I control, the more national security I have, the more minerals I control, the more national security I have, especially in my own neighborhood. And I think that sort of seems to be one of the motivating factors. It has been fascinating to see an entire discussion about Maduro and Venezuela that was based on drugs and immigration shift now to oil.
Oh yeah, drugs. Remember those? Carolina, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just very quickly, one thing that I think is important to understand about Venezuelan history. Back in the 70s and 80s, uh, Venezuelans, especially because of the oil boom, Venezuelans were very close to the United States. Venezuela was a major ally of the US, and Venezuela was very close to the US culturally. When half of South America was absolutely crazy about soccer or football, Venezuelans were playing baseball, and we are a major, baseball, fan country, and there are a lot of baseball players in the baseball leagues in the US, and that will always be the case because and that's has a lot to do with oil because American companies were always based in Venezuela and that's how baseball came to Venezuela because of the oil companies. So that culture and those ties between both countries remain to this day beyond the difficult relationships that the countries had. That changed with Chavez coming into power because Chavez came with a very strong anti-imperialist rhetoric. And then that, closeness between the two nations changed when Chavez came to power and Chavez brought the Cubans. And then, we started seeing a lot of Cubans in the country, Cuban doctors, Cuban sport coaches, etc. And then Chavez, became closer to Russia and to China. And then, I mean, if you drive in the streets of Caracas, you will see construction, companies building houses with the flag of Russia. You can see that in Caracas. But I don't think that necessarily translated into cultural and social ties between Venezuelans and Russians or Venezuelans and Chinese people. I still think that there is a much stronger connection between Venezuelans and the United States, because we cannot forget that there are over 1 million Venezuelans in the US with a lot of family ties and connections. So I think that relationship will be easier to be, rebuilt if the Trump administration does things well, than maintaining a relationship with Russia and China, where I don't think culturally, historically, or socially there was ever a real basis for those countries and Venezuelans to build strong ties.
All right, well, let's wrap up. I'd ask each of you to spend 30 seconds telling us the one thing that we haven't talked about yet, and bonus points if you mention Cuba, which seems to be lurking in the background, but we haven't had a lot of time to talk about. Let me go to Sam, Bob, and then Carolina to wrap us up.
I'm not going to get bonus points, but I am going to focus on immigration. Temporary protected status and other protections for Venezuelans trying to flee persecution is top of mind for me. So the U.S. administration has significantly limited irregular migration at our southern border. At the same time, they have systematically been going through lawful immigration pathways and statuses here in this country to seriously diminish them. So as we think about just the range of populations in this country under TPS, whether Venezuelan, Somalia, or otherwise, I just am very, very, very mindful of what's going to happen to those folks. Well, we've been on this call, I think the president just revoked TPS for Somalis. Like as we think about all these other places that he's conducting operations, I'm concerned about the impact for folks here.
Bob, and then Carolina. Thank you, Sam.
So I think, if you will, a couple of things I keep in mind. Again, watch what Delcy has to do. Watch how she has to balance all of the different people, right? We still have colectivitos on the street, right? We still have the same generals that were accused of making money by drug cartels. Like, all of these things still exist. What are the competing interests she has to deal with? I think the other thing is we didn't raise really the political nature here in the United States. I think people talked about this a lot for a while, but that also was when Florida was in play. And right now, Florida is a pretty solidly red state. So the fact is, and that's where almost all of the Venezuelan population is, from what I could see. It's not a very large population, but it's almost all in Florida. That's not really something that anybody has to cater to one way or the other. The Cuban population is much larger. That is also largely in Florida. And I think watching the Cuban population and what they start saying as this goes on a little bit more, how Marco Rubio feels about this, is going to be an interesting piece in terms of influence for Donald Trump. We've already seen how the Cuban American lawmakers in the House were able to influence Donald Trump and what he did in terms of passing legislation, because three members of Congress is enough to change a Republican majority into a minority in the House. Those politics pieces here back in the U.S., I think will be interesting to watch, as well as the politics of how Delcy Rodriguez keeps her head and keeps her head, if you will.
And Carolina, why don't you wrap us up?
Well, it is clear that Venezuela's infrastructure is in shambles, and the country really needs international support. And the U.S. can help in the reconstruction of the country. There are several bills in Congress that we hope could be passed. The PANA Act, for example, is a bill to work on the management of asset recovery. We have been supporting that bill. There are a lot of assets in the U.S. That are, part of corruption, assets that are, there are billions of dollars here that need to be used, but they should be managed, and they should be going to the Venezuelan people. The same goes for, all those funds that State Department is still going to be distributing to Latin America. There are bills in Congress to be discussed. Venezuelan civil society and humanitarian actors still need funding to support the people of Venezuela. So we hope that in the next few weeks, as Congress discuss all of these bills, the needs of the Venezuelan people are put into consideration when these discussions take place.
Well, no, thank you all for such a tremendous conversation, to Sam and Bob and Carolina. Two things as we sign off. The first is that if you are a Venezuelan member of the Penn community, in the chat in the Zoom interface is a list of Penn resources for students, faculty, staff from Venezuela. So please take advantage of that. Reach out to international student services and relevant offices at the university if there's anything you need from the university. And second is please don't forget to sign up for our first in-person event of the year, which will be this Thursday, January 15th. We will discuss global climate change negotiations with Sue Biniez, Sally Box, and Anne Rasmussen. Thanks again to Sam and Bob and Carolina for joining us for an amazing conversation about Venezuela. And I'm not sure whether I hope or don't hope that we are back here talking about this again soon, given what that could mean for the world. But thanks everybody for tuning in, and have a great day.